In the summer of 1921, America witnessed one of its worst ever acts of racial violence. In the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a white mob attacked the district of Greenwood, a wealthy African-American enclave known as Black Wall Street. Over 2 brutal days, the whites destroyed everything, burning down 35 blocks and killing up to 300. In the aftermath, Tulsa's elites closed ranks, hushing up the massacre, one so brutal that it's been called America's Kristallnacht. Today, the story of the massacre is being rediscovered, taking its rightful place in the public consciousness thanks to documentaries and fictional shows like Watchmen. But what's less commonly discussed is what exactly was lost that fateful day. Born from the ashes of the Civil War and the Oklahoma land grab, Greenwood, by 1921, had grown into a microcosm of African-American aspiration. This was a community where traders and millionaires rubbed shoulders, where doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, and service staff strived together to create a community by black folk for black folk. In today's Geographics, we're telling the story of Oklahoma's forgotten black utopia. Perhaps fittingly for a story that ends in tragedy, the tale of Greenwood begins not with its official founding in 1906, but with an even earlier moment of racial violence, the Trail of Tears. In 1830, the US government began the forcible displacement of Native Americans from their ancestral homes in the South. Members of the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole nations were driven west, resettled on a supposedly useless scrap of land then known as Indian Territory. The process was violent, brutal. Thousands died en route. But it wasn't just the Native Americans who suffered. Their black slaves endured misery too. At the time of the forced removal, the affected tribes were known to white America as the 5 civilized tribes. This was because they had things like written constitutions and so-called European customs, things which meant white America might still kill them, but at least they felt bad about killing them. Chief among those customs was the habit of owning slaves. When the Creek and Cherokee arrived in their new homes, the borders of which ran right through modern Tulsa, they brought with them enslaved black men and women. Over subsequent decades, the Cherokee slave population grew, finally hitting 15% of the nation in 1860. Then the Civil War erupted and everything changed. You could probably make a whole video on Native American involvement in the Civil War, so complex and little discussed is the subject. But since that's not today's topic, we'll just have to give you the super simple version. The 5 tribes fought on both sides and got screwed over by everyone. The Union imposed the same post-war peace on Indian Territory as on the South, forcing the Cherokee and Creek to free their slaves. But they went one step further. They forced them to give them land. One of the Reconstructionists' great dreams was to give all freed people 40 acres and a mule to start their new lives. But then the gigantic sentient sphincter known as Andrew Johnson became president and the idea was scrapped, with the exception of those freed in Indian Territory. Creek freed people, for example, could vote, serve as tribal representatives, and build their own schools. As the Civil War faded into bitter memory, they began to set up ranches to create townships. Over the next few decades, over 50 all-black townships would spring up in the part of Indian Territory analogous with modern Oklahoma. The biggest and most successful of all these would be Greenwood. But Greenwood wouldn't be established until 1906, and only then because of successive events that massively increased black migration into the territory. The first of these was the Compromise of 1877. The previous November, the presidential election ended in an effective draw, with rival electors in several states reporting 2 sets of results, one for the Democrats, one for the Republicans. The stalemate ended with a backroom deal in which Republicans got the presidency in return for Reconstruction ending and federal troops departing the South. This being the South, the local governments were all like, "Woo, great, let's get back to being dicks to our black citizens." It was the beginning of Jim Crow, an era of racist laws, of lynchings, of daily terror inflicted upon the South's free people. For black folks suffering under the white boot heel, the conditions for ex-slaves that they saw when they looked to Indian Territory weren't just different, they were an inspiration, a dream to be chased. It was a dream best expressed by Edwin P. McCabe, who saw better than anyone how a mass black migration from the South to Indian Territory could bring about a transformation. "The time will soon come," he wrote in 1891, "when we will be able to dictate the policy of this territory or state. And when that time comes, we will have a Negro state governed by Negroes." It was from this dream that Greenwood would be born. If the first chapter of black migration into Oklahoma was the Rotten Compromise of 1877, then the second would be the Oklahoma Land Rush. Starting in 1889, the rush happened when the US government realized that useless land it had sent the 5 tribes to go settle in the Trail of Tears wasn't actually so useless after all. So they threw it open to white settlement, giving Americans just a few months' notice that they'd soon be able to charge in and grab whole plots of unassigned land. At least that was the plan. In reality, while the Oklahoma Land Rush started out as just that, a rush, it soon transformed into a land grab. In 1893, for example, the land earmarked for white settlement already belonged to the Cherokee Nation, a pattern that would repeat with other tribes in subsequent years. The other difference was the settlers themselves. While the government expected a great white wave unrolling across the continent, the reality was that many involved in the land rush were black. Of these black pioneers, easily the most significant to our story was O.W. Gurley. Ottaway W. Gurley was born on December 25, 1868, to freed slaves in Alabama. Raised in Arkansas, he grew up to take a job with the US Postal Service. But while this work was secure, Gurley was a dreamer, so rather than stay in Arkansas, he decided to join the Great Migration West. That was how, on the 16th of September 1893, Gurley came to be waiting on the edge of the Cherokee Outlet with his 25-year-old wife, Emma, ready to run. The moment the starting gun was fired on what would become Oklahoma's largest ever land run, Gurley was off like a shot. That day, there were far more people looking to stake claims than there was available land. You had to be fast. Gurley ran for 50 long miles before finally the crowds thinned out and he was able to stake his plot on a swath of prairie grass. Others nearby were doing the same. In no time, this chaotic scramble would grow into the town of Perry. It was a town Gurley had a very specific vision for. I believe in the creed expressed by Edwin P. McCabe, Gurley hoped to bring as many black people in as humanly possible. All the way till 1905, he advertised Perry as the utopia that black folk were looking for. In the end, though, it wouldn't be in Perry that Gurley found his answer to Wakanda. That's because the third chapter of Black America's push west was about to be written, the one simply titled Oil. In 1901, oil was struck at Red Fork, sparking a new rush, this time for black gold. As more gushers were located, word started to filter out of the fortunes being made near Tulsa, and Gurley wanted in on that action. In 1905, he sold up and abandoned Perry, heading 80 miles to distant Tulsa. But rather than go work in the oil fields or become a prospector, Gurley had a different plan, one that would involve taking advantage of the oil wealth accumulating in the city. On the outskirts of Tulsa, Gurley purchased 40 acres of property north of the railroad. He built a general store, then subdivided the rest of the land into plots for new homes and new businesses, plots he only wished to sell to other black people. It was the beginning of Greenwood, of a town that would soon show white America just what its oppressed minority was capable of. Although Gurley's 1905 arrival heralded the birth of Greenwood, he wasn't the first black man to make his way to Tulsa. By this point in history, the city was becoming a magnet for dreamers. The boom had begun in 1882 when the St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad came zipping through. By 1890, Tulsa had a school, hotel, police station, and 1,000 residents, many of whom had stepped off the railroad looking to build new lives. Among them were African Americans drawn by the promises of Indian Territory. By the time Tulsa incorporated in 1898, 1 in every 20 residents was black. This number included future Greenwood luminaries like lawyer J.B. Stradford. Born into slavery in Kentucky, Stradford had since risen up in the world of business, where experience led him to believe black people would get further if they pooled their resources. When Gurley arrived, Stradford would be 100% on board with his Greenwood project. But it wasn't just the promise of black-run neighborhoods that was pulling people to Tulsa. It was a host of factors, from the oil money to the fact that Indian Territory, while not exactly trouble-free, at least didn't systematically discriminate against non-whites. In fact, Tulsa in these early years suffered far less racial violence than many other cities. Prior to 1907, Oklahoma lynchings were almost white-on-white affairs. Frontier justice meted out to rustlers rather than anti-black terrorism. Sadly, that fact would soon change, but not before Greenwood had a chance to grow. In 1906, O.W. Gurley opened Greenwood's first official business, an African-American-only boarding house. From there, he began to work towards his goal of a city for black people, by black people. A goal that meant stuff like selling plots of land to others escaping the former slave states. Stuff like organizing a fund for black entrepreneurs who wanted to start a business. Most of all, though, it meant building a community, forging a shared identity, one that would ensure black money stayed in Greenwood, in an area when things like wealth and success were meant to be synonymous with white. Ironically, it would be Tulsa's white residents who'd helped this come to pass, albeit in the worst possible way. As black people had migrated west from the south, so had their old white neighbors. As they settled, these southerners brought with them habits and opinions forged in the Confederacy in a slave economy. So when they decided to bring Oklahoma back into the Union in 1907, you better believe they made it as like the Deep South as possible. The admission of Oklahoma was the beginning of the end for any kind of racial tolerance. The good old boys writing the state constitution ensured sweeping Jim Crow laws were enacted everywhere. Suddenly, the people of Tulsa were legally prevented from mixing. Even if a black family had previously thought about moving anywhere but Greenwood, they no longer had the choice. But while the virulent racism that was taking hold in Oklahoma would eventually lead to one of America's darkest days, it would first have a very different effect. It was partially thanks to Jim Crow that Greenwood became filthy rich. At this point, we should probably specify what Jim Crow meant for Greenwood, because it didn't mean complete separation. While over 40% of the district's population were skilled workers, the remaining 60% worked blue-collar or domestic jobs which often required them to travel to the white part of town. Nor were Tulsa's whites barred from physically entering Greenwood. White Tulsans would occasionally travel into the district to visit certain shops or to eat at certain restaurants. Greenwood's success then lay not in walling itself off from the white world, but in keeping the money inside, in allowing black citizens to profit from the success of black businesses. After all, Greenwood's skilled workers had money, so why not encourage them to spend it locally? With Jim Crow keeping residents out of the white theaters and restaurants in Tulsa, businesses soon started mushrooming up across Greenwood to meet the demands of the black middle class. Movie theaters, pool halls, nightclubs, fancy eateries, jewelry stores, luxury hotels, you name it, if it was desirable, Greenwood had it. Soon the district's microcosm had grown beyond just leisure and entertainment. There were schools, banks, hospitals, even a newspaper, the Tulsa Star. Thanks to all this choice, it's estimated every dollar in Greenwood changed hands 19 times before it left the district. People got rich. They got rich enough to buy automobiles, big homes, even private airplanes. Some residents even got involved in the oil business, becoming millionaires. When the US entered World War I, they made even more money through oil-related war bonds. This is the Greenwood that Booker T. Washington dubbed Negro Wall Street, a Greenwood that soon became one of the wealthiest districts in the state. So maybe now's the time to discuss what it actually looked like. The first thing to note is that Greenwood's appearance was relatively modest. Despite the nickname, it was home to none of regular Wall Street's high-rises. Instead, 2 to 3 floor red brick and wood-framed buildings sat along wide streets, projecting prosperity on a human scale. The heart of everything was an area known as the Marquee Block, down on the district's south near the rail line dividing Greenwood from White Tulsa. This was where most of the businesses were located. It was also the area where you could do things like take in a show at the famous Dreamland Theatre or grab a drink at the Zulu Lounge, or if it was early to be drinking, hit the Bell and Little Cafe for one of their famous 6-course meals. Further out toward the residential districts, the wealth became a little more conspicuous. The most conspicuous was probably J.B. Stradford's 55-room luxury hotel, a place perfectly calibrated to the expensive tastes of the Roaring Twenties. Out on North Detroit Street too, the houses of Greenwood's wealthy screamed money. The local physician and property tycoon, Dr. R.T. Bridgewater, for example, lived in a house contemporary reports summed up as palatial. The wealth was also reflected in the people you'd see out and about. While there were plenty of ordinary Joes, there were also families in big, expensive motorcars or women sporting cutting-edge fashion. Yet Greenwood wasn't notable for just the wealthy it attracted. Among its residents were people like A.C. Jackson, a shy doctor who'd been called, quote, the most able Negro surgeon in America, and Buck Colbert Franklin, a lawyer with a track record in winning civil rights cases. It's these lives that were shattered in the summer of 1921, these wonderful ordinary streets that were burned by the mob, along with iconic local buildings like the locally funded Mount Zion Baptist Church. Remember, this is when our story turns and the killing starts, because Greenwood wasn't just some abstract place fossilized in the past where we don't have to care about it. For 10,000 people, it was home. As Greenwood grew and prospered just across the rail tracks, something else was growing too: the malignant tumor of racism. Post-1907, Oklahoma's lynchings had stopped being white-on-white violence, become instead a tool for black oppression. Awful as they were, though, it wasn't just the lynchings that were poisoning the state. Racial violence doesn't come out of nowhere. It boils over from the elites telling you to distrust or fear that kind of person, from law changes designed to make some groups seem irredeemably other. In post-statehood Oklahoma, these laws included racist taxes and literary tests. They included a state Supreme Court upholding voting restrictions. They also included a government that preferred not to prosecute white violence. This was the era of the whipping party, when gangs of whites would take a black person accused of some offense and whip them within an inch of their lives. It was also an era when all the messages blaring out of civil society told an endless story, that black people were inferior, that they didn't deserve nice things. In places like Tulsa, people started to believe it. Now, we've been careful to point out in this video that Greenwood wasn't exclusively middle class and wealthy. A large blue-collar contingent lived there too. But they weren't what poor whites in Tulsa saw when they looked across the railroad tracks. No, they saw the fancy houses, the motor cars, the people everyone said were inferior, enjoying their hard-earned success. It wasn't long before resentment began to fester, a resentment that would soon find a dangerous outlet. In late 1915, the Ku Klux Klan was reborn on a Georgia mountaintop, announcing their return with the burning of a gigantic cross. As a city already home to many descendants of Confederate soldiers, Tulsa was perfectly placed to welcome the revived organization. Come 1920, the Klan had gained such a large foothold in the city that its local chapter even had a children's division, part of a nationwide youth movement informally known as, we kid you not, the Ku Klux Kiddies. Yep. But don't go thinking that Tulsa was in some way unique. In this era, racial violence was endemic across America. The past few years had seen the rise of race riots, in inverted quotes, effectively shock attacks on non-white communities designed to cow locals and make them live in fear. On Christmas Eve in 1907, for example, the town of Henryetta, Oklahoma had seen a white mob burn down the black district, lynch one resident, and enact sundowner laws, meaning that any black person in town after sundown could be beaten or murdered. It was just one of many such so-called race riots that gripped the nation in those years, culminating in the Red Summer of 1919. Despite the name Red Summer actually took place from mid-spring all the way through to late fall and marked perhaps the lowest moment in race relations since the Civil War. Across the United States, white mobs attacked countless black communities, killing hundreds, maybe even thousands, and leaving tens of thousands scarred and traumatized. If you've ever read about Europe's historical pogroms and thought, gee, I'm glad we don't have those in America. Well, Red Summer was their equally bloody equivalent. In Greenwood, the news of these anti-black massacres put residents on high alert. The Tulsa Star started a campaign for armed posses to show up at the courthouse whenever black people were put on trial to make sure that they weren't lynched. Sadly, though, all these armed black men just gave white Tulsa the excuse it needed. On May the 31st, 1921, black teenager Dick Rowland was arrested for supposedly harassing a white woman. Simultaneously, a white lynch mob and an armed escort of 75 Greenwood residents converged on the courthouse. In the confusion and tension, someone fired a shot. It was the spark that would set Tulsa ablaze. The next morning, after a night of anti-black violence, a white mob stormed Greenwood. As airplanes buzzed overhead, dropping homemade firebombs onto homes, the mob shot, stabbed, and burned its way across 35 blocks. By the time the sun rose on June the 2nd, Black Wall Street would be no more. The toll of the 1921 massacre in Greenwood remains hard to stomach even now, 100 years later. In 2 days of violence, Tulsa's whites destroyed 35 blocks, detained 6,000 people in internment camps, left up to 10,000 homeless, and killed around 300 people. To put that in perspective, Oklahoma's other great act of far-right violence, the Oklahoma City bombing, killed a little over half that number. The Greenwood massacre was simply unlike anything the state had ever seen before or since. In the aftermath, the city hushed up the violence. Black survivors were blocked from getting insurance payouts. Not a single white perpetrator was ever punished. There was even a plan to completely raze the destroyed district to stop the survivors returning, a plan only derailed when the Greenwood lawyer Buck Cobb Franklin challenged it in court. All told, the destruction that summer is thought to have amounted to $27 million. Black Wall Street was hollowed out. But amazingly, it wasn't destroyed. If you're only vaguely aware of the story of Greenwood, this might be the most surprising part. Following Franklin's legal victory, some survivors returned. Not all, many were ruined by the massacre and never recovered. J.B. Stradford, for example, had to flee Chicago after he was accused of provoking the white mob to violence. But enough returns, enough that by 1926, W.E. Dubois was able to write of Greenwood, "Black Tulsa is a happy city. It has new clothes. It is young and gay and strong. 5 little years ago, fire and blood and robbery leveled it to the ground. Scars are there, but the city is impudent and noisy. It believes in itself." In this short description, we can catch a glimpse of another possible world, one in which Greenwood rebounded, in which its community spirit survived even the horrific violence of 1921. Sadly, though, that's not the world we live in. While Greenwood did experience a second boom, by the 1970s, it had all been undone. Tulsa's white elite attacked the city again, not physically this time, but economically. Black homes were purchased under eminent domain and demolished to make way for a highway that came crashing through the center, leveling much of what had been rebuilt. The road's proximity sent house prices crashing. Over the following decades, the descendants of those who'd returned and rebuilt slowly packed up and moved away. Urban renewal, gentrification, all the ills of the modern world stacked up to hollow out Greenwood further and further until there was almost nothing left. Today, Greenwood still exists. You can go there and do a walking tour, but what remains is a shadow of what once stood there. A single historic block of black-owned businesses run through with an ugly highway. Black Wall Street, in short, is no more. The story of Greenwood is an undeniable tragedy, a moment in America's history that was shamefully hushed up, even as it left lasting psychological scars on the survivors and their families. But it's also something else, a tale of a lost paradise, of a place more significant and more spectacular than it's often given credit for. The story of the Greenwood Massacre is today taking its rightful place in the history books. Hopefully, the district itself, vibrant, confident, and rich, can be remembered alongside it, not just as the site of violence, but as a place that briefly, wonderfully, showed Black America what was possible. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do use that thumbs up button below. Do not forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.